In the autumn of 1937, to stand upon the crest of Purple Mountain and gaze down at the city of Nanking was to witness the beating heart of a nation's dream. Below, nestled in a sweeping bend of the great Yangtze River, the city was a sprawling tapestry of old and new, a place where the ghosts of dynastic glory walked hand in hand with the ambitions of a modern republic. This was not just a city, it was a statement. Nanking, the southern capital, had been chosen by Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic, to be its cradle. It was here that the future of China was being forged in steel, concrete, and the vibrant, chaotic energy of millions. NTHE air, crisp with the coming of winter, carried the sounds of this grand project. From the river docks, the horns of steamships announced the arrival of goods from every corner of the globe, their hulls laden with wool from Australia, machinery from Germany, and automobiles from America. Along the wide, newly paved boulevards, named for the nation's new heroes and ideals, the city's elite glided by in polished black Buicks, their children looking out at a world that seemed to be expanding with limitless promise. The streets hummed with the rattle of trams, the shouts of vendors, and the ceaseless murmur of a populace convinced of its own ascent. This was the decade of Nanking, a brief, shining moment when it was the political, economic, and cultural center of China, a jewel whose facets reflected the aspirations of 400 million people. In ancient history was the city's foundation. The colossal Ming-era walls, 40 feet high and wide enough at the top for a carriage to ride upon, encircled it all. For 600 years, these ramparts had stood as a symbol of impenetrable strength, a silent guardian against the tumult of the ages. Within their embrace, the city breathed. Narrow, winding alleyways, paved with worn cobblestones, twisted through neighborhoods where life had followed the same rhythms for centuries. Here, the air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts, simmering broths, and the sharp, sweet smell of osmanthus blossoms. Grandparents, their faces maps of a harder past, watched over children playing games of chance and skill, their laughter echoing against courtyard walls. The old ways were not gone, they were the deep, steady bass note against which the thrilling melody of the new was played. NBUT, the new, was everywhere, and it was intoxicating. The government of the Kuomintang, led by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, had poured the nation's wealth into its capital. Grand government buildings, built in a hybrid style of Western classicism and Chinese motifs, rose with imposing confidence. There was a new Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Supreme Court, and the vast Central Military Academy, all designed to project an image of strength, order, and permanence. The city was a magnet, drawing in the best and the brightest. Intellectuals debated the future in smoky tea houses, poets found their muse along the shores of Xuanwu Lake, and entrepreneurs laid plans for factories and fortunes. The Central University of Nanking was a beacon of higher learning, its students filled with a fierce patriotic fervor, eager to serve the Republic and defend it against all threats. NFOR, the foreign community. Nanking was a city of comfort and fascination. Diplomats and businessmen lived in spacious villas with manicured gardens, attended lavish parties at exclusive clubs, and observed the unfolding Chinese drama with a mixture of admiration, amusement, and commercial interest. They saw a city shedding its feudal skin, a market opening its doors, a people awakening. Missionaries, too, had established their own small empires of faith and service. They ran hospitals that offered modern medicine to the poor, and schools and universities, like the Jinling Women's College, that provided an education to those who would have been denied it a generation before. They were part of the city's fabric, their presence, a testament to Nanking's cosmopolitan spirit. Life for the ordinary citizen was a world away from the diplomatic receptions and government ministries, yet it was no less vibrant. It was a life lived in public, on the crowded streets and in the bustling markets. It was the tailor, hunched over his sewing machine, turning out a Western-style suit. It was the rickshaw puller, his body lean and hard as wire, navigating the chaotic traffic with practiced grace. It was the farmer from the countryside, his boat laden with cabbages and ducks, poling his way up a canal to the morning market. It was a million small, interlocking lives, each one a thread in the city's immense and colorful brocade. There was hardship, yes. Poverty was a constant companion for many. But it was hardship tinged with hope, a belief that tomorrow would be better than today, that their children would know a China their parents could only dream of. And this was the great, unspoken promise of Nanking in 1937. It was a city looking forward, not back. Its gaze was fixed on a horizon of progress, of national unity, of a respected place among the great nations of the world. The storm gathering to the east, in the land of the rising sun, was a concern, of course. The newspapers spoke of tensions, of incidents, of the ever-present threat of Japanese ambition, but the sheer, overwhelming reality of Nanking, its size, its energy, its monumental walls, created a powerful illusion of security. The war was something that happened elsewhere, a distant rumble of thunder that could not possibly breach the sanctuary of the capital. The jewel of the Yangtze felt safe, permanent, and eternal. It was a city utterly, tragically oblivious that it was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to be plunged into an abyss of suffering so profound it would leave a permanent scar on the soul of the world. The autumn of its dreams was about to give way to a winter of unimaginable horror. While Nanking dreamed, Shanghai burned. Just 200 miles to the east, the vibrant international metropolis had become a charnel house. For 3 relentless months, from August to November 1937, the Battle of Shanghai had raged, a conflict of such apocalyptic ferocity that it would be nicknamed Stalingrad on the Yangtze. It was here, in the smoke-choked streets and shattered alleyways of China's largest city, that the nation's finest soldiers were fed into the grinding gears of modern warfare. And it was here that the spirit of both armies would be forged, one in the crucible of desperate, heroic defense, the other in the fires of a furious, frustrated, and ever more brutalizing assault. NTHE battle had been Chiang Kai-shek's defiant stand. He had chosen to fight for Shanghai, to commit his best German-trained divisions to a conventional, head-on confrontation with the Imperial Japanese Army. His goal was twofold: to bog down the Japanese war machine and, more importantly, to show the Western powers that China would not fold. He wanted to fight in the full glare of the international spotlight, hoping that the spectacle of Chinese resistance and Japanese aggression would finally provoke intervention from Britain, France, or the United States. For a time, it seemed the gamble might work. The world watched, astonished, as Chinese soldiers, often poorly equipped but fighting with suicidal bravery, held their ground against Japan's overwhelming superiority in air power, naval guns, and heavy artillery. NTHE fighting was primordial. In districts like Rabe, entire city blocks were reduced to fields of rubble, pulverized by naval bombardments from Japanese warships anchored in the Huangpu River. The sky was a constant swarm of Japanese bombers, their engines, a terrifying drone that became the soundtrack to the city's death throes. Below, the battle was fought yard by yard, house by house. Chinese soldiers, armed with rifles, machine guns, and, quote, potato masher grenades, turned every building into a fortress. They burrowed through walls to create hidden passages, set up sniper nests in shattered windows, and launched daring counterattacks at night, their bayonets flashing in the light of burning buildings. The defense of the Sihong warehouse, where a single battalion held out for days against impossible odds, became a legend, a symbol of China's unbreakable will. NBUT heroism could not hold back the tide of steel indefinitely. The cost was staggering. For every Japanese soldier who fell, the Chinese lost 3, 4, or even 5. The elite divisions that formed the backbone of the nationalist army were bled white. These were the men who were supposed to have been the future of China's military, and their bodies now lay piled in the ruins of Shanghai. The Japanese, too, were paying a heavy price. They had expected a swift, surgical victory, a repeat of their easy conquest of Manchuria. Instead, they found themselves locked in a meat grinder, their own casualties mounting at an alarming rate. The fierce resistance shattered their sense of martial superiority and replaced it with a deep, simmering rage, a rage against the Chinese soldiers who refused to break, and a contempt for the civilians who supported them. NBY early November, the breaking point came. After months of frontal assault, the Japanese executed a series of amphibious landings south of the city, outflanking the exhausted Chinese defenders. The carefully constructed defense lines, which had cost so much blood to hold, were suddenly rendered meaningless. The choice was no longer between victory and defeat, But between annihilation and retreat, the order was given, but it came too late and was poorly communicated. What was intended to be an orderly withdrawal quickly degenerated into a full-blown, chaotic rout, and the retreat from Shanghai was a vision of hell. Discipline, which had held firm for 3 months under unimaginable pressure, simply evaporated. Units disintegrated. Soldiers, their nerves shattered, their ammunition spent, their officers dead or missing, threw down their weapons and fled west, their only thought to escape the inferno. They clogged the roads, a desperate human torrent, mingling with terrified civilians who were also trying to escape the Japanese advance. The roads became a nightmare of gridlock and panic. The Japanese Air Force, now commanding the skies with impunity, treated the fleeing columns as a vast shooting gallery. Bombs rained down on the packed roads, strafing runs scythed through the crowds, turning the escape routes into corridors of death. For the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army who entered the ruins of Shanghai, the victory was bitter. They had won, but they had been made to fight for it with a savagery that had shocked and hardened them. They walked through a city of corpses, the stench of decay hanging heavy in the air. They saw the faces of their own dead and the defiant glare in the eyes of the captured. A dangerous transformation had taken place within them. The frustration of the long battle, the high casualties, and the dehumanizing nature of the urban warfare had stripped away layers of discipline and restraint. A thirst for vengeance, a cold contempt for their enemy, and a sense of absolute power over the vanquished began to take hold. This was the army that now turned its eyes west. This was the Iron Tide, brutalized and enraged, that now began its inexorable march toward the capital. The cauldron of Shanghai had forged them into a weapon, and that weapon was now aimed directly at the heart of China, the unsuspecting, unprepared, and tragically vulnerable city of Nanking. As the iron tide of the Japanese army swept across the land, a decision of monumental consequence had to be made, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, tense halls of power. The fate of Nanking and its million souls rested in the hands of one man, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of nationalist China. The fall of Shanghai had been a devastating military blow, but it was also a profound personal and political humiliation. Now, with the enemy closing in on his capital, he was faced with an agonizing choice, a gamble that would be debated by historians for decades to come, its outcome written in the blood of hundreds of thousands. NTHE's strategic reality was grim, and his German military advisors, men like Alexander von Falkenhausen, saw it with cold, professional clarity. Nanking was a geographical death trap. The city was flanked on 3 sides by the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Yangtze River, with the enemy approaching from the only open side, the east. A defending army, if its lines were breached, would have its back to the water with no viable means of retreat. The ancient city walls, while imposing, were not designed to withstand modern artillery and aerial bombardment. Furthermore, the army that would be tasked with this defense was a shadow of the force that had fought in Shanghai. It was a shattered, demoralized collection of retreating units, supplemented by raw, undertrained conscripts who had never seen combat. To commit these troops to the defense of Nanking, his advisors argued, was to condemn them to certain annihilation and to sacrifice the city for nothing. The logical military strategic choice was clear: declare Nanking an open city, withdraw the government and the army further inland to the more defensible city of Wuhan, and preserve what was left of China's fighting force to continue the war. This was the voice of military reason. But Chiang Kai-shek was not just a general, he was a political leader, acutely aware of the symbolic power of a nation's capital. To abandon Nanking without a fight, he feared, would be a catastrophic blow to national morale. It would signal to the Chinese people and to the world that the government had lost its will to resist. After the immense sacrifices made in Shanghai, a retreat from the capital could be perceived as a total collapse, potentially shattering the fragile unity he had forged among China's competing warlords. He had built his regime around the image of a strong, defiant China, and Nanking was the very symbol of that strength. How could he now order its surrender without firing a single shot? There was another, more personal dimension to his calculus. Chiang was a proud man, deeply invested in the concept of honor, both his own and the nation's. The capital, the sacred resting place of Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Republic, could not simply be handed over. A stand had to be made. A fight, however hopeless, was necessary to uphold the nation's dignity. This sentiment was echoed by a powerful faction within the Kuomintang, led by hardline, nationalistic officers like Tang Shengji. They argued passionately that to abandon the capital would be an act of unforgivable cowardice. Tang, in particular, was vocal and persuasive. He spoke of honor, of patriotic duty, and of making the ultimate sacrifice. He publicly declared that he would share the fate of the city, vowing to lead a defense that would turn Nanking into a graveyard for the Japanese army. Caught between the grim logic of his German advisors and the impassioned, patriotic rhetoric of his Chinese commanders, Jiang vacillated. For days, the decision hung in the balance. Meetings were held, arguments were made, the fate of 1 million people debated. In the end, the pull of symbolism and the pressure of the hardliners won out. Jiang made his fateful choice. Nanking would be defended. He appointed Tang Shengji as the commander of the newly formed Nanking garrison force, entrusting him with the city's defense. It was a decision born of a desperate hope that a show of defiance might somehow turn the tide, or at the very least, prove to the world that China was not yet beaten. But it was a gamble made with a doomed hand. Having made the decision to fight, Jiang and the rest of the government then proceeded to evacuate. On December 7th, with the Japanese vanguard just miles from the city gates, the Generalissimo and his wife, Song Mei-ling, boarded the last plane out of Nanking, relocating the government apparatus to the safety of Wuhan. He left behind a city filled with over 100,000 hastily assembled troops, many of whom were exhausted veterans of the Shanghai nightmare, and a civilian population that had swelled to nearly 1 million with the influx of terrified refugees. He also left behind General Tang Shengji, a commander known more for his political ambition and bold proclamations than for his military acumen. Tang, in a disastrous move meant to instill a fight-to-the-death resolve, ordered all boats on the Yangtze to be removed or destroyed, effectively sealing the only route of escape. The trap was now set. The Generalissimo had made his wager, but it was the soldiers and citizens of Nanking who would be forced to pay the terrible price of his losing bet. While the generals debated and the fate of the city was sealed in high-level meetings, a different kind of drama was unfolding on the streets of Nanking. It was a frantic, desperate, and deeply unequal race against time. The decision to defend the capital was a public proclamation of defiance, but behind the scenes, a far more pragmatic and cynical operation was underway: the Great Escape. For those with money, with influence, with foreign connections, the writing on the wall was not in the ink of patriotic slogans, but in the cold, hard calculus of survival. The exodus of the elite began, a torrent of wealth and power draining from the city just as the tide of war was about to crash upon its shores. NTHE first to leave were the highest echelons of the Kuomintang government. The ministries, once bustling with the self-important energy of a nation's bureaucracy, began to empty out. Files were hastily packed or burned, offices were shuttered, and officials, with their families and fortunes in tow, made their discreet way to the city's airfields and docks. The departure of Chiang Kai-shek on December 7th was the silent, screaming signal that the ship was sinking. If the captain himself was taking to the lifeboats, there was no hope left for the vessel. His departure, and that of the entire government apparatus, created a vacuum of authority and leadership at the precise moment the city needed it most. The shepherds were fleeing, leaving the flock to the wolves. NTHE flight of the government was followed by the flight of the city's moneyed class. The wealthy industrialists, the bankers, the merchants, all the men who had built their fortunes in the boom years of the Nanking decade, now used that wealth for its ultimate purpose, to buy their way to safety. The price of a seat on a plane to the interior cities of Hankow or Chongqing skyrocketed, reaching astronomical sums that only the richest could afford. The roads leading west out of the city were choked with polished black cars, their trunks laden with family treasures, their passengers' faces etched with a fear that no amount of money could entirely soothe. They were leaving behind their grand villas, their businesses, their factories, everything that had defined their status, all of it sacrificed for the simple, primal need to live, NTHE exodus created a surreal, two-tiered reality within the city. While the wealthy fled in cars and planes, the port on the Yangtze River became a scene of human desperation. The steamships that had once brought goods and glamour to the city were now the last hope for the moderately well-off, the shopkeepers, the mid-level functionaries, the academics. Tickets for passage upriver became more precious than gold. Crowds surged at the docks, a chaotic mass of humanity waving cash and pleading with ship captains. Families were separated in the crush, their cries lost in the cacophony of steam whistles and panicked shouts. The decks of the departing ships were packed so tightly that people could barely move, a human cargo of the fortunate few, their last sight of the capital, a receding skyline under a sky increasingly filled with the ominous drone of Japanese reconnaissance planes. NBUT for every person who escaped, thousands were left behind. The vast majority of Nanking's population, the laborers, the rickshaw pullers, the small artisans, the servants, had neither the money nor the connections to flee. They were trapped. Their predicament was made infinitely worse by a cruel irony. As the city's elite emptied out, its population was simultaneously being swollen by a massive influx of refugees from the surrounding countryside. These were the peasants and villagers whose homes had been in the direct path of the Japanese advance. They had lost everything, their farms, their possessions, their families, and had run to the capital, believing that the great walls of Nanking would offer them sanctuary. They arrived starving, exhausted, and traumatized, bringing with them first-hand accounts of the horrors they had witnessed. Their stories spread through the city's tea houses and alleyways, seeding a new and terrible fear, a fear that contradicted the government's bold promises of a heroic defense. This mass influx of refugees put an unbearable strain on the city's resources. Food became scarce, and prices began to climb. The city, once a symbol of order, began to fray at the edges. A sense of abandonment took hold. The people of Nanking looked around and saw that their leaders were gone, their wealthiest citizens had vanished, and their protectors were a demoralized and disorganized army. They were left with only the ancient walls, the incoming tide of desperate refugees, and the terrifying stories that preceded the enemy's arrival. The exodus of the elite was more than just a physical departure. It was a profound act of betrayal. It stripped the city of its leadership, its wealth, and its confidence, leaving behind a population that was poor, leaderless, and utterly vulnerable, waiting in the shadow of the great walls for a fate they could not escape. As the last planes and steamships departed, carrying away the wealth and power of the capital, a small and improbable group of people made a decision that ran counter to every instinct of self-preservation. They chose to stay. While their own embassies issued stark warnings and offered passage to safety, while the Chinese elite they had once socialized with vanished upriver, this handful of Westerners looked at the terrified faces of the people around them and found themselves unable to leave. They were not soldiers or diplomats with a duty to remain. They were businessmen, doctors, professors, and missionaries. Men and women who had, until that moment, lived lives of relative privilege and comfort. But in that crucible of fear and abandonment, they would be forged into something else entirely, the city's last, fragile conscience. There were perhaps no more than 24 of them in total, a tiny international community in a city of 1 million. Their reasons for staying were as varied as their professions. For some, it was a matter of professional duty. Dr. Robert Wilson, a brilliant young surgeon at the University Hospital, felt he could not abandon his patients. He knew that in the coming battle the need for his skills would be overwhelming, and he was the only qualified surgeon who would be left in the entire city. For others, it was a matter of faith and moral responsibility. Minnie Vautrin, the dean of Ginling Women's College, saw the thousands of Chinese women and girls who looked to her for protection. Her college, with its American flags and foreign status, was a sanctuary, and she was its guardian. To flee would be to betray every principle she had ever taught, to abandon her flock at the moment of greatest peril. And for others still, the decision was born from a deep, abiding affection for the city and its people. They had spent years in Nanking, had built lives there, and felt a sense of belonging that transcended nationality. They could not, in good conscience, turn their backs on the community that had become their home. Among them was a figure who would become one of history's most unlikely heroes, a German businessman named John Rabe. Rabe was, paradoxically, a loyal and card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. He was the head of the local Siemens company, a man who enjoyed the respect of both the Chinese and the foreign communities. He was a patriot, proud of his fatherland, and his status as a representative of a nation then allied with Japan afforded him a unique position of influence. He could have left easily. He had a ticket to safety in his pocket, but as he watched the panic grow, as he saw the city being stripped of its leaders, a profound sense of duty took hold of him. He saw the impending humanitarian catastrophe with absolute clarity and decided he had to do something. This small band of foreigners began to meet, their gatherings held in an atmosphere of mounting dread. They were from America, Germany, Britain, and Denmark, a league of ordinary individuals united by an extraordinary circumstance. They knew the Japanese army was coming, and they knew from the stories of the refugees what that army was capable of. They also knew that the Chinese defense was doomed, and that once the city's walls were breached, the civilian population would be utterly at the mercy of the conquering soldiers. Drawing inspiration from a similar effort by a French missionary in Shanghai, they conceived of a desperate, audacious plan to create a neutral, demilitarized zone within the city, a sanctuary where non-combatants could shelter from the storm. They began the frantic work of planning the Nanking safety zone. They drew up maps, designating an area of the city that contained the university, the hospital, and several foreign-owned properties. They reasoned that the Japanese, out of respect for international law and a desire to avoid conflict with Western powers, might be persuaded to honor the neutrality of such a zone. John Rabe, with his German nationality and Nazi Party credentials, was elected chairman of the committee, believing his swastika armband could serve as a bizarre and powerful shield. They petitioned their own embassies, pleaded with the departing Chinese government for recognition, and prepared to present their proposal to the advancing Japanese army. It was a plan built on little more than hope and the flimsy authority of their foreign passports. They had no weapons, no army, no official power. All they had was their courage, their moral conviction, and their shared commitment to stand between the innocent and the abyss. They were a tiny island of humanity, bracing themselves for a tidal wave of barbarism, the foreigners who stayed to bear witness. They had watched over the city for more than 600 years. They were not merely a fortification, they were a geological feature, a man-made mountain range encircling the capital. The Great Walls of Nanking, built by the first emperor of the Ming dynasty, were an enduring testament to a time of imperial grandeur and absolute power. For centuries, they had stood as the ultimate symbol of security and permanence, their immense bulk a silent promise of protection against the chaos of the outside world. Now, in the bitter December of 1937, as the Japanese army closed its iron ring around the city, this ancient girdle of stone and earth was called upon to serve as the last line of defense for nearly 1 million trapped and terrified souls. NTO stand at their base was to be humbled. They rose to heights of 40, 50, even 70 feet, their foundations built from massive blocks of granite, their core a formidable mass of compacted earth and rubble, all faced with millions of large, gray bricks, each one stamped with the name of the official responsible for its quality. They were a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, a project of such colossal scale that it had taken 200,000 laborers over 2 decades to complete. The wall snaked for more than 21 miles around the city, its top wide enough in most places for several horsemen to ride abreast. It was punctuated by 13 massive gates, each one a fortress in its own right, protected by towering gatehouses and complex systems of courtyards and barbicans designed to trap and slaughter any attacking force. NFOR the citizens of Nanking. The walls were a part of the landscape of their lives, as constant and familiar as the rising sun or the flow of the Yangtze. Children played in their shadow, lovers sought quiet moments along their ramparts, and merchants passed through their gates every day, paying little mind to their original martial purpose. The walls were history, they were heritage, a source of civic pride. They had withstood rebellions, repelled bandits, and outlasted dynasties. They were the city's bones, the very framework upon which its identity had been built. And so, in the face of the coming invasion, it was natural for the people to look to them with a desperate, almost superstitious hope. They had always been there. They had always held. Surely they would hold again. NBUT the hope was a fragile illusion, a prayer whispered against the roar of modern warfare. The Chinese soldiers now manning these ancient defenses were a pitiable sight. They were the exhausted remnants of the Shanghai campaign, mixed with terrified new conscripts who had been given a rifle and a few days of training before being pushed onto the ramparts. They were poorly led, poorly equipped, and utterly demoralized. They huddled behind the thick parapets, their thin cotton uniforms offering little protection against the biting winter wind. They had rifles, a few machine guns, and a smattering of aging artillery pieces, but they possessed none of the anti-tank weapons or heavy cannons needed to repel a modern, mechanized army. From their positions on the wall, they could see the enemy gathering. The Japanese forces were a terrifying spectacle of industrial might. They brought with them heavy artillery that could pound the ancient bricks to dust from miles away. Their tanks, impervious to rifle fire, could rumble forward to blast open the gates. And above, their air force commanded the skies, free to drop bombs on the defenders with impunity. The Great Walls, designed to stop cavalry charges and scaling ladders, were a magnificent anachronism, a medieval giant facing a 20th century killer. General Tong Shengji, in his desperate attempt to create a fortress, had ordered the massive city gates to be closed and barricaded with sandbags and stones. It was a gesture of defiance, a declaration that there would be no retreat. But in doing so, he had turned his own capital into a cage. He had sealed his army and the city's civilian population inside, with their backs to the impassable Yangtze River. The walls were no longer a shield. They had become the perimeter of a vast prison. They were the last barrier, the final membrane separating a million lives from the horrors of the outside world. And as the first Japanese shells began to find their range, screaming through the winter air to smash against the ancient bricks, every soul in Nanking could feel that barrier begin to tremble. The Great Walls, the city's eternal guardian, were about to face their final, most terrible test. The waiting was a torment of its own. For days, the city had held its breath, suspended in a state of surreal, agonizing tension. The gates were sealed, the government was gone, and the enemy was just beyond the horizon, a felt presence more than a seen one. Life in Nanking had ground to a halt, replaced by a collective, silent vigil of fear. People stayed indoors, hoarding what little food they had, speaking in hushed tones, listening. Every distant sound, every dog's bark, every gust of wind rattling a window pane, was magnified, interpreted as the herald of the coming storm. The drone of a lone Japanese reconnaissance plane, circling high overhead, was the only concrete sign of the siege to come, a vulture patiently tracing the outlines of its intended meal. The city was a coiled spring of anxiety, and on December 9th, that spring finally snapped. It began not with a roar, but with a strange, whistling sigh that tore through the cold morning air. For a fraction of a second, there was confusion, a collective questioning of the sound. Then came the impact. A geyser of earth, stone, and black smoke erupted near the southern walls, followed a heartbeat later by the deep, guttural crump of the explosion. The ground shuddered. Windows rattled miles away, a moment of stunned silence, and then another whistle, another explosion, closer this time, and then another, and another. The siege of Nanking had begun. The first shells had fallen, and with them, the city's last, fragile illusion of safety was irrevocably shattered. NFOR, the Chinese soldiers huddled on the ramparts. The bombardment was a descent into a hell they could not fight. The Japanese artillery, positioned on the hills of Purple Mountain and beyond the range of the defenders' own meager cannons, began a systematic, methodical demolition. The shells came in waves, screaming down from a cold, gray sky. They were not aimed at the soldiers themselves, but at the wall, the ancient stone guardian that was their only protection. Each impact was a cataclysm. 600-year-old bricks, each one the size of a man's torso, were pulverized into dust. Chunks of the rampart weighing tons were blasted into the air, tumbling down to crush anything or anyone below. The very structure of the wall groaned under the assault, the compacted earth of its core trembling as if in agony. NTHE soldiers could do nothing but press themselves against the stone, making themselves as small as possible, praying that the next shell would not find them. The noise was a physical force, a deafening, continuous roar that vibrated through their bones, shaking their teeth and their skulls. It was a sound that erased all other sounds, all thought, leaving only a primal animal terror. The air became thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the choking dust of pulverized stone and earth. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Men were buried alive in collapsed sections of the parapet. Others were killed by shrapnel, their bodies torn apart by jagged pieces of hot metal. Still others were simply concussed into oblivion by the sheer force of the blasts, left bleeding from the ears and nose, their minds wiped clean by the overwhelming violence of the sound. While the artillery pounded the walls, the Japanese Air Force went to work on the city itself. Squadrons of bombers appeared over the city, flying in neat, unmolested formations. The few Chinese planes that had been left to defend the capital were quickly shot out of the sky, their burning fuselages spiraling down to leave black scars on the city they had tried to protect. With the skies completely under their control, the Japanese pilots could operate with terrifying leisure. They flew low, their engines a menacing drone that sent civilians scrambling for cover. They targeted the city's infrastructure, the barracks, the power station, the few remaining government buildings, but their bombs were not precise. They fell on crowded neighborhoods, on marketplaces, on residential streets. NFOR, the civilians of Nanking, the world became a lottery of death. A family huddled in their small home could be alive one moment and vaporized the next. A street teeming with panicked people could become a crater filled with bodies. The bombs were not just instruments of death, but of terror. They were designed to break the will of the city, to turn the population against its own defenders. The high-explosive bombs shattered buildings, but the incendiaries were perhaps worse. They scattered fire and chemical agents that clung to wood and fabric, starting infernos that were impossible to fight. Columns of greasy black smoke began to rise from a dozen different points in the city, merging into a dark pall that blotted out the winter sun. The first shells, the first bombs, did more than just kill and destroy. They annihilated the city's morale. The defiant slogans painted on the walls and the bold promises of General Tang Shengji now seemed like a sick joke. How could human courage stand against this relentless, impersonal, industrial slaughter? The bombardment revealed the terrifying truth of their situation. They were trapped in a cage, and the bars of that cage were now being systematically dismantled by an enemy they could not see and could not fight. The noise, the smoke, the trembling earth, the constant proximity of sudden, random death, it all combined to create an atmosphere of pure, helpless terror. The city was no longer a place of homes and streets, but a vast, open-air abattoir. The first shells had fallen, and in their devastating impact they had sounded the death knell for the old Nanking, signaling the beginning of its transformation into a landscape of ruin and a theater of unimaginable suffering. For 3 days, the city endured the relentless storm of steel and fire. The ancient walls, which had stood for 6 centuries, were now bleeding from 1,000 wounds. The southern face of the wall, particularly around the imposing Zhonghua Gate, had borne the brunt of the Japanese artillery and aerial bombardment. It was here that the decisive assault would come, a final, overwhelming push designed to crack the city's defenses and unleash the waiting horde. The Chinese soldiers, deafened, exhausted, and running desperately low on ammunition, braced for the inevitable ground attack. They had withstood the shelling, but now they would have to face the enemy eye to eye. And on the morning of December 12th, the bombardment intensified to a terrifying crescendo. A curtain of fire and smoke descended upon the southern wall, a final, brutal softening up for the infantry assault. Then, through the haze and dust, they came. Japanese soldiers, bayonets fixed, swarmed forward under the cover of their own artillery. They were supported by tanks, their steel hulls impervious to the defenders, rifle fire, their cannons blasting away at the machine gun nests that had survived the shelling. The assault was focused and ferocious. The Japanese soldiers used scaling ladders to ascend the battered walls, climbing over the bodies of their own fallen comrades to reach the top. And on the ramparts, the fighting devolved into a medieval nightmare. It was a desperate, close-quarter struggle of bayonets, rifle butts, and swords. The Chinese soldiers, many of whom were barely trained, fought with a raw, desperate courage. They pushed ladders from the walls, threw grenades down at the attackers, and engaged in savage hand-to-hand combat. For a few frantic hours they held. The first waves of Japanese attackers were repulsed, their bodies piling up at the base of the wall. But the pressure was relentless. For every Japanese soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The Chinese defenders were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior firepower. NTHE breaking point came at the Zhonghua Gate. A Japanese suicide squad, laden with explosives, managed to reach the base of the massive gatehouse under withering fire. The resulting explosion was immense, a titanic blast that tore a gaping hole in the ancient structure. It was the breach the Japanese had been waiting for. A flood of soldiers from the elite 6th Division poured through the opening, establishing a foothold inside the city's defensive perimeter. At the same time, other units that had successfully scaled the walls began to fan out, attacking the Chinese defenders from the rear. NTHE collapse, when it came, was sudden and total. The carefully constructed, albeit fragile, chain of command evaporated in an instant. The Chinese defense did not break, it disintegrated. Panic, the most contagious of all battlefield diseases, spread like wildfire along the wall. The cry went up. The Japanese were inside. It was a death sentence. Soldiers who had been fighting bravely moments before now saw the futility of their position. They were being encircled, their escape route, the city behind them, now compromised. The instinct for survival overwhelmed the discipline of the soldier. What followed was a desperate, disorganized rout. The defense of Nanking was over. The new imperative was to escape. Soldiers threw down their weapons, a symbolic and tragic admission of defeat. Their next desperate thought was to shed the one thing that marked them for certain death, their uniform. They tore off their jackets, their hats, their insignia, anything that identified them as part of the Chinese army. They frantically tried to acquire civilian clothes, trading for them, stealing them, or stripping them from the dead. Their goal was to melt into the civilian population, to become anonymous faces in the crowd, hoping that in the chaos they could evade the notice of the victorious Japanese. This act, born of desperation, would have catastrophic consequences. By shedding their uniforms and hiding among the populace, they inadvertently blurred the line between combatant and non-combatant. In the eyes of the advancing Japanese soldiers, who were already conditioned to see every Chinese male as a potential enemy, this confirmed their worst suspicions. It meant that any man could be a soldier in disguise. It gave them the pretext they needed to treat the entire male population of Nanking as a hostile force. The rout from the southern gate was more than just a military collapse. It was the trigger for the horror that was to follow. As the last vestiges of organized resistance crumbled to dust, the city and its people were left completely naked and defenseless, awaiting the arrival of an army that now saw every shadow as a threat and every civilian as a potential target. The collapse of the southern wall did not just let the Japanese army in. It unleashed a tidal wave of pure animal panic that surged through the city's streets. The news, carried by breathless, terrified soldiers who had thrown down their arms, spread faster than fire. The defense had failed. The enemy was inside the walls. The city was lost. In that moment, the entire population of Nanking, the demoralized garrison and the million civilians, was seized by a single overwhelming impulse to flee. And there was only one direction to go. North. North, toward the Shaguan Gate and the cold, gray promise of the Yangtze River beyond. What followed was one of the most horrific scenes of human desperation in modern history. A human avalanche, a torrent of tens of thousands of people, began to pour through the city's northern districts. The wide boulevards and narrow alleyways became choked with a frantic, stampeding mass. There was no order, no reason, only the physics of a crowd gone mad with fear. Soldiers who had just been fighting for their country now pushed and shoved alongside the very civilians they were supposed to protect. The strong trampled the weak. Children were torn from their parents' arms, their cries swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The elderly and the infirm fell, vanishing beneath the countless running feet, their lives extinguished in the crush. NTHE destination for this human flood was the Xiaoguan Gate, one of the main portals leading out of the city to the river docks. But General Tang Shengji, in his earlier catastrophic miscalculation, had ordered the gates sealed to prevent desertion. The massive wooden doors were barred shut, barricaded with sandbags, stones, and abandoned vehicles. When the front of the panicked mob reached this impassable barrier, The result was a nightmare. The thousands pressing from behind had no idea the way was blocked. They continued to surge forward, compacting the crowd at the gate into a solid, suffocating mass of human flesh. People were crushed to death while still standing, their lungs unable to draw breath. The screams of those being squeezed and trampled at the front were horrifying, a sound of pure agony that was lost in the greater din of the stampede. Some soldiers, in a desperate frenzy, tried to scale the city walls near the gate. They formed human pyramids, clawing at the sheer brick face, many falling to their deaths on the packed crowd below. Others, seeing the main gate was a death trap, swarmed towards smaller, lesser-known portals, only to find them locked as well. The wall, once the city's shield, had become the instrument of its agony, a cruel and impassable barrier penning the sheep for the slaughter. NTHE ultimate goal, the river itself, offered no salvation. It was a final, terrible illusion. In another of Tang Shengji's disastrous orders, all boats, the junks, the sampans, the ferries, had been confiscated or destroyed days earlier to prevent any unauthorized retreat. The docks were empty. The vast, slate-gray expanse of the Yangtze, nearly a mile wide at this point, was a cold, empty void. There was no escape. For the few who managed to find a piece of driftwood or a stray fishing boat, their fate was no better. Japanese patrol boats on the river, along with planes flying overhead, treated anything that moved on the water as a target. Machine gun fire ripped across the surface, turning the river red, riddling the desperate swimmers and flimsy rafts with bullets. Many, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, simply gave up. They sat down amidst the chaos, their faces blank with despair, waiting for the end. Others, in a final act of agency, chose their own death, throwing themselves into the freezing, fast-moving currents of the Yangtze, their bodies swept away by the indifferent water. The scene at the Xiaoguan Gate and the riverbank was the tragic, bloody climax of the Generalissimo's gamble. It was a self-inflicted wound, a catastrophe created not by the enemy, but by the incompetence and panic of the city's own defenders. Tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers and civilians died here, without a single Japanese soldier having yet entered this part of the city. They were killed by the crush, by the fall, by the water, by the sheer, overwhelming force of their own collective terror. It was a river of no escape, and its banks were now a testament to the complete and utter collapse of the defense of Nanking. December 13, 1937. A date that would be forever burned into the memory of Nanking, a day that began with an eerie, unnatural silence. The storm of the siege, the endless shelling, the rattle of machine guns, the roar of the panicked crowds had finally passed. In its place, a profound and terrifying quiet descended upon the wounded city. For the inhabitants who had survived the night, huddled in their homes or in the darkened corners of the newly established safety zone, this silence was not a relief. It was a sound pregnant with dread, the held breath before a final, terrible scream. It was the silence of a city that had been conquered, a city that now lay utterly prostrate, awaiting the will of its new masters. Through the shattered gates and over the breached walls, the soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army began their formal entry. This was not the chaotic, blood-soaked rush of the initial assault. This was the victor's procession. They marched in disciplined columns through the main thoroughfares, their hobnailed boots crunching on the debris-strewn streets. The soldiers were grim-faced, their eyes scanning the shuttered windows and empty alleyways with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. They were the conquerors, and the very air seemed to crackle with their power. The culmination of their march was the ceremonial raising of their flag, the Hinomaru, the red sun disk on a field of white. On the rooftops of the captured government buildings, the Chinese flag was torn down, and the flag of the Empire of Japan was hoisted in its place. The sun flag, stark and clinical against the smoke-stained sky, was a declaration of absolute dominance. Nanking, the proud southern capital, was now a Japanese possession. NFOR, a few fleeting hours, this veneer of military discipline held. The initial entry was orderly, almost formal. The soldiers marched to their designated billets, securing key intersections and strategic points throughout the city. The few civilians who dared to peek from their hiding places saw what appeared to be a professional army taking control. A fragile, desperate hope may have flickered in some hearts. Perhaps the worst was over. Perhaps now that the battle was won, order would be restored. Perhaps the conquerors would be magnanimous in their victory. It was a hope born of a profound ignorance of the darkness that had festered within this army on its brutal march from Shanghai. This illusion of order was deliberately cultivated, a brief, theatrical pause before the true nature of the occupation would be revealed. The Japanese command, led by General Iwane Matsui, who entered the city a few days later, saw Nanking not just as a military objective, but as a symbol. Its capture was meant to be the blow that would shatter the will of the Chinese nation and force its surrender. To achieve this, the population had to be cowed, terrorized, and utterly broken. The instrument of this terror would be the very soldiers now marching so placidly through the streets. NTHE's first act of this terror began with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. The Japanese command issued a proclamation, posted on walls throughout the city, ordering all former Chinese soldiers to register at designated points. The proclamation promised fair treatment, even leniency, for those who complied. It was a calculated, venomous lie. For the thousands of Chinese soldiers who had shed their uniforms and were hiding among the civilian population, this seemed like a possible lifeline. They were starving, terrified, and cut off. The promise of food and safety, however flimsy, was a powerful lure. Encouraged by their families or by a desperate hope for survival, thousands of young men emerged from their hiding places and turned themselves in. They gathered in huddled, anxious groups at the designated locations. The Japanese soldiers supervising the roundups were initially calm, almost professional. They took names, searched the men, and herded them into large, open spaces, schoolyards, empty lots, government squares. But as the numbers swelled, the mood began to shift. The pretense of leniency began to fall away, replaced by an open and contemptuous hostility. The captured men were bound together with ropes and wire, their hands tied tightly behind their backs, their pleas and questions met with blows from rifle butts. This was the first systematic harvest of the men of Nanking. The Japanese had a clear, unspoken objective: to eliminate any potential source of future resistance. Every former soldier was a threat, a seed of a future insurgency. The decision was made not to imprison them, but to exterminate them. As the sun began to set on December 13th, the first batches of these captured men were marched away. They were led out of the city gates they had so recently defended, their faces etched with the dawning, horrifying realization that they had been tricked. They were not being led to prisoner of war camps, they were being led to their deaths. The sun flag now flew over the capital, and under its shadow, the first methodical, large-scale massacres were about to begin, turning the fields and riverbanks outside the city into killing grounds. The brief, eerie silence was over. The screaming was about to start. The promise of leniency was a ghost that vanished with the setting sun. As darkness fell upon the conquered capital, the true intentions of the Japanese army were unleashed with an industrial and pitiless ferocity. The thousands of Chinese soldiers who had surrendered, who had naively placed their trust in the victor's honor, were the first to be fed into the machinery of death. The fields, hills, and riverbanks on the outskirts of Nanking, places that had once been serene landscapes, were about to be transformed into vast, open-air execution grounds, forever consecrated by the blood of the vanquished. NTHE's process was brutally systematic. The captured men, their hands bound tightly behind them with wire or rope, were herded into long, shuffling columns. They were marched under heavy guard out of the city gates, their path illuminated by the cold glare of truck headlamps or the flickering light of torches. The Japanese soldiers who escorted them were no longer the disciplined troops of the victory parade. They were now executioners, their faces hard and impassive, their bayonets prodding any who stumbled or faltered. The prisoners knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that they were walking their final steps. Some wept openly. Some prayed. Others walked in a state of numb, silent shock, their minds unable to fully comprehend the scale of the betrayal. NTHE destinations were varied, but the outcome was always the same. One of the largest groups, numbering in the thousands, was marched to the banks of the Yangtze River near the northern Xiaguan Gate, the very place where so many had died in the panicked crush just days before. Here, in the freezing darkness, they were lined up facing the water. The Japanese soldiers set up machine guns, creating a deadly crossfire. The order was given: and the night erupted in a deafening, sustained roar of automatic weapons fire. The bullets ripped into the packed ranks of men, who fell in tangled heaps, their bodies tumbling down the muddy banks and into the cold, dark water. The killing went on for what seemed like an eternity, the gun barrels glowing red-hot, the air filled with the screams of the dying and the metallic stench of blood. For those who were only wounded, who lay moaning among the dead, there was no mercy. The Japanese soldiers walked among the piles of bodies with bayonets and pistols, methodically finishing off any who still showed signs of life. The Yangtze, the great mother river of China, became a tomb, its currents carrying away the bodies in a silent, ghastly procession. Other groups were taken to different locations for different methods of slaughter. At a gorge near the Yuwatai Terrace, another massive contingent of prisoners was forced into a narrow, sunken trench. The Japanese soldiers lined the ridges above them, creating a natural killing pit. From this vantage point, they rained down death upon the men below, not just with machine guns but with grenades, their explosions echoing horribly in the confined space. When the initial slaughter was over, the soldiers doused the pit with gasoline and set it ablaze, incinerating the dead and the living alike in a single horrific pyre. The smoke from this fire would hang over the southern part of the city for days, a foul-smelling testament to the atrocity. Killing was not always so impersonal. For some Japanese units, the executions became a form of grim sport, a way to blood new recruits or to indulge in a depraved martial pride. Prisoners were used for bayonet practice, their living bodies serving as training dummies for soldiers learning how to thrust and kill. They were tied to posts and used for target practice. Decapitation contests, like the infamous one between two officers that was reported with pride in a Japanese newspaper, became a symbol of the utter depravity that had taken hold. The sword, once a symbol of the samurai's honor, was now just another tool for butchery. These mass executions, carried out over several days and nights, were a calculated act of policy. The goal was the complete eradication of the Chinese army's remnants in Nanking. It was a logistical decision. The Japanese did not have the resources or the desire to house and feed tens of thousands of prisoners, but it was also an act of profound terror. The sheer scale of the killing was meant to be a message, a demonstration of the absolute and terrible power the Japanese now wielded. By eliminating the city's defenders in such a brutal and public fashion, they were extinguishing any spark of future resistance. They were turning the very land around the city into a monument of fear. The killing fields of Nanking were the first, and in many ways the most organized, chapter of the massacre. But this was only the beginning. The violence, having been unleashed on the soldiers, would now, like a plague, turn its attention inward, toward the helpless civilian population still trapped within the city walls. As the machinery of slaughter began its gruesome work on the outskirts of the city, a desperate and unprecedented humanitarian experiment was taking shape within its walls. It was an island of hope in an ocean of terror, a fragile sanctuary born from the courage and conscience of the few foreigners who had refused to abandon Nanking. This was the Nanking Safety Zone, a last-ditch effort to shield the city's civilian population from the impending storm, a place that would, for a few horrific weeks, become the most densely packed parcel of land on Earth. Idea, conceived in the frantic days before the city's fall, was simple in principle, but immensely complex in practice. The International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, led by the unlikely figure of the German businessman John Rabe, had designated a section of the city as a neutral, demilitarized area. The zone was roughly the size of New York's Central Park, an area of about 2.5 square miles in the western part of the city. It was chosen strategically as it contained most of the foreign-owned properties, including the University of Nanking, Jinling Women's College, and the University Hospital, as well as several foreign embassies. The committee's hope was that the Japanese army, out of a desire to avoid an international incident, would respect the neutrality of these properties and the foreign flags that flew over them. NTHE Committee worked with feverish energy. They drew crude maps and printed thousands of armbands for the Chinese volunteers, who would help police the zone's boundaries. They marked the perimeter with banners and flags, flimsy lines of cloth and paper that were meant to hold back a battle-hardened army. John Rabe, in his capacity as chairman, sent letter after letter to the Japanese command, pleading for them to recognize the zone and spare the civilians within it. He leveraged his status as a German citizen and, most bizarrely, his membership in the Nazi Party, hoping his swastika armband would act as a shield, a symbol of an allied power that the Japanese would be forced to respect. It was a surreal and desperate gambit, using the emblem of one totalitarian regime to plead for mercy from another. And as the Chinese defense crumbled and the first Japanese soldiers entered the city, a human flood began to pour into the designated area. The news of a safety zone, a place where the foreigners would protect them, had spread through the city like a prayer. It was the only glimmer of hope in a city gripped by absolute terror. From every corner of Nanking, civilians came, carrying what few possessions they could manage: a bundle of clothes, a bag of rice, a crying child. They abandoned their homes, their neighborhoods, everything they had ever known, and ran towards the promise of sanctuary. NTHE zone was instantly overwhelmed. The 27 designated refugee camps, mostly located in the large, empty buildings of the universities, were filled to capacity within hours. The population swelled from an expected 50,000 to, by some estimates, over 250,000 people. Every square foot of space was occupied. People crammed into classrooms, auditoriums, and libraries, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on the cold floors. The open grounds of the campuses became vast seas of people, huddling together for warmth against the bitter winter cold, with only thin blankets or makeshift tents for shelter. The sanitation systems broke down almost immediately. Food and clean water became dangerously scarce. The safety zone was not a comfortable refuge. It was a scene of immense and concentrated human misery. NBUT. It was misery preferable to the terror outside its unmarked borders. The members of the International Committee, men like Dr. Robert Wilson, the missionary Louis Smythe, and the goddess of Nanking, Minnie Vautrin, became the administrators of this desperate city within a city. They were no longer just doctors or professors. They were now quartermasters, police chiefs, and diplomats. They organized rationing for the dwindling food supplies, tried to maintain a semblance of order, and, most importantly, patrolled the perimeters. They became human shields, using their foreign faces and their sheer moral courage as their only weapons. They would race to the edge of the zone to confront Japanese soldiers attempting to enter, arguing, pleading, and physically blocking their path. The birth of the safety zone was an act of profound faith in the idea that even in the darkest of times, a line could be drawn, a stand could be made, and a small pocket of humanity could be defended. For the hundreds of thousands who sheltered there, it was, quite simply, the only reason they survived the weeks to come. The mass executions on the city's outskirts had eliminated the organized threat of the captured Chinese army. But for the Japanese soldiers who now occupied Nanking, the war against the Chinese mail was far from over. In their minds, conditioned by the brutal fighting in Shanghai and the official propaganda that dehumanized their enemy, every man of military age was a soldier in disguise, a guerrilla in waiting, a seed of future rebellion. With the initial wave of killings complete, the hunt now turned inward, spreading from the fields and riverbanks into the very heart of the city. A citywide manhunt began, a terrifying and systematic purge that transformed every street, every alleyway, and every home into a potential trap. NTHE hunt was methodical in its randomness. Squads of Japanese soldiers, often drunk on looted liquor and high on their own absolute power, roamed the city with impunity. They moved in small patrols, kicking down the doors of houses, their bayonets at the ready. Their methods for identifying a soldier were crude, arbitrary, and almost always fatal. A man with a suntanned face and neck was suspected of being a soldier who wore a cap. A man with calluses on his hands was accused of having carried a rifle. A man with a sharp indentation on his shoulder was presumed to have borne the weight of a heavy pack. Even something as simple as a man looking frightened, or not frightened enough, could be enough to seal his fate. NTHE terror was inescapable. No man was safe. They were dragged from their dinner tables, pulled from their beds, snatched from the arms of their screaming wives and mothers. They were taken from all walks of life: shopkeepers, scholars, rickshaw pullers, laborers. Their pleas of innocence were ignored, their identities irrelevant. They were simply male, of a certain age, and therefore guilty. Once captured, their fate was sealed. They were rarely taken far. The executions were swift, brutal, and often public, designed to maximize the psychological terror inflicted upon the community. Men were shot on their own doorsteps, their bodies left as a warning to their neighbors. They were bayoneted in the middle of the street, their deaths a spectacle for anyone forced to watch. They were herded into small groups and led to the nearest open space, a small park, a canal bank, a deserted square, and machine-gunned, their bodies left where they fell. The city began to fill with the dead. Corpses littered the streets, their blood staining the cobblestones, their vacant eyes staring up at the cold winter sky. The living were forbidden from burying them, a deliberate act of psychological warfare that left the dead to be picked at by stray dogs and crows, a constant, gruesome reminder of the conqueror's power. NTHE's safety zone, that fragile island of sanctuary, was not immune to the hunt. Despite the tireless efforts of John Rabe and the other committee members, the Japanese soldiers treated the zone's boundaries with contempt. They would storm into the crowded refugee camps, their rifles brandished, and begin their grim selection process. They would stride through the masses of huddled refugees, scanning the faces, looking for anyone who fit their vague profile of a soldier. A young man's height, his posture, his haircut. Any of these could be enough to condemn him. NTHE scenes within the zone were heartbreaking. The foreigners would try to intervene, placing themselves between the soldiers and their intended victims, arguing and pleading. John Rabe's Nazi armband sometimes worked, confusing the Japanese soldiers enough for them to back down. But more often than not, the committee members were simply shoved aside, their authority dismissed with a laugh or a blow from a rifle butt. They were forced to watch, helpless, as men were dragged away from their families. The women would cling to their husbands, sons, and brothers, their wails of grief echoing through the camps. But their efforts were futile. The chosen men would be roped together and marched out of the zone, their destination the same as all the others, a shallow grave or a bloody street corner. The hunt for men was a campaign of systematic extermination disguised as military necessity. It was designed to emasculate the city, to remove its strength, its will to resist, and its future. It was a terror that targeted 1/2 of the population, and in doing so, inflicted a soul-crushing wound upon the other. If the hunt for men was a campaign of extermination, the terror unleashed upon the women of Nanking was a campaign of profound and sadistic degradation. It was a violence that sought not just to kill the body, but to annihilate the spirit, to defile the very heart of the family and the community. In the weeks following the city's capture, Nanking was subjected to a wave of mass rape of such scale and brutality that it remains one of the most horrific chapters in the history of modern warfare. No woman of any age or status was safe. The city became a hunting ground, and its female inhabitants were the prey. NTHE violence was not random or incidental. It was a pervasive and systematic tool of conquest, an unspoken but widely understood privilege of the victorious soldier. The Japanese army, from its highest commanders to its lowest foot soldiers, created an environment where sexual violence was not only tolerated, but implicitly encouraged. It was seen as a right of the conqueror, a way of asserting ultimate dominance over the vanquished population. The rapes were acts of power, designed to humiliate not just the woman, but her family, her ancestors, and her entire culture. It was a form of terror that struck at the most intimate and vulnerable level of human existence. NTHE horror was everywhere. Squads of soldiers, their inhibitions dissolved by alcohol and the complete absence of restraint, would break into homes at any hour of the day or night. They would demand hango, or young girls, their requests often accompanied by threats and violence against the male members of the family. Fathers, husbands, and brothers who tried to protect their female relatives were often shot or bayoneted on the spot, their deaths serving as a brutal prelude to the violation that would follow. The women were then dragged away, often in front of their terrified children. NTHE assaults were characterized by an extreme and often fatal brutality. It was not uncommon for women to be subjected to gang rapes, assaulted by a dozen or more soldiers in succession. The violence was frequently accompanied by torture and mutilation. Women were violated with bayonets, sticks, and other objects. Many did not survive the ordeal, their bodies left broken and discarded. Those who did survive were left with devastating physical injuries and a psychological trauma so deep it would shadow them for the rest of their lives. The age of the victims ranged from elderly grandmothers in their 70s and 80s to young girls who had not yet reached puberty. The sanctity of life's beginning and end was obliterated by a lust that knew no boundaries and a cruelty that knew no shame. And even places of worship offered no sanctuary. Women who fled to temples, hoping for divine protection, were dragged from behind altars and raped. The city's Buddhist nuns, who had sworn themselves to a life of chastity, were among the most sought-after victims, their violation seen as a particularly potent act of defilement. The safety zone, while offering a greater degree of protection, was far from immune. The refugee camps were a constant target for roving patrols of soldiers. They would storm into the crowded dormitories, their flashlights scanning the terrified faces, looking for young women to carry off into the night. The foreign committee members did what they could, but they were a handful of unarmed civilians against an army. They could argue, they could protest, but they could not be everywhere at once. And in a desperate attempt to protect themselves, the women of Nanking tried to make themselves unattractive. They cut their hair short, smeared soot and mud on their faces, and wore the most shapeless, unattractive clothing they could find. Young girls were disguised as boys, but these were pitiful defenses against a force that was determined to take what it wanted. The terror was absolute and inescapable. It poisoned every interaction, every moment. The sight of a Japanese soldier approaching was a signal for every woman to run, to hide, to pray. The terror unleashed on the women of Nanking was a wound from which the city would never fully recover. It was a deep, collective trauma, a memory of violation so profound that for decades, many of its survivors would be unable to even speak its name, carrying their silent agony as the city's most terrible and enduring scar. In the heart of the safety zone on the campus of Xinling Women's College stood a fortress. It was not a fortress of stone or steel, but one of sheer, indomitable will. Its commander was a middle-aged American missionary from Illinois named Minnie Vautrin. To the thousands of terrified women and children who sought refuge within her college walls, she was more than just a protector. She was a living saint, a guardian angel. They would come to call her the goddess of Nanking, a testament to the almost supernatural courage she displayed in the face of unimaginable horror. For 6 weeks, Minnie Vautrin and her small staff would wage a daily, hourly war against the tide of barbarism, her campus becoming the last and most sacred sanctuary for the women of the city. Wunji Inling College was an oasis of American-style buildings and manicured lawns, a place that had been dedicated to the education and empowerment of Chinese women. When the crisis began, Vautrin made the conscious decision to turn her beloved institution into a refugee camp. She believed, or at least desperately hoped, that the American flag flying prominently over the campus would deter the Japanese soldiers. She prepared for a few hundred refugees. Within days, she was sheltering more than 10,000. Every classroom, every dormitory, every hallway, and every corner of the chapel was filled with a terrified human sea of women, children, and the elderly. Minnie Vautrin's life became a relentless cycle of vigilance and confrontation. She seemed to never sleep. Her slight figure, clad in a simple dress, became a constant presence, patrolling the perimeter of the campus, her eyes always scanning for danger. The greatest threat came from the roving gangs of Japanese soldiers, who refused to honor the sanctity of the zone. They would appear at the college gates at all hours, drunk, armed, and demanding women. It was here that Vautrin would make her stand. Unarmed, relying only on the force of her personality and the authority of her foreign status, she would physically block their path. NTHE confrontations were terrifying. She would stand at the gate, face to face with soldiers who had just come from committing unspeakable acts, and refuse them entry. She would argue, she would plead, she would scold them, as if they were misbehaving schoolboys. She would point to the American flag and declare the campus to be American property, off limits to the Imperial Army. Sometimes, miraculously, it worked. The soldiers, confused by this fearless foreign woman who showed them no deference, would back down and leave. But often, they would simply push past her, forcing their way onto the campus to begin their hunt. When they breached the perimeter, Vautrin would follow them, her voice a constant stream of protest. She would run through the crowded buildings, trying to hide the youngest and most vulnerable girls. She would pull soldiers off of women they were attempting to assault, physically inserting herself into the most dangerous situations imaginable. She could not stop every attack, She was forced to witness horrors that would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she never stopped trying. Her presence alone was a shield. The soldiers knew that at Ginling College, their actions would not go unchallenged, that a fierce, unyielding woman would be there to bear witness and call them out for their crimes. Throughout this ordeal, Minnie Vautrin kept a diary. Her entries, written by candlelight in the dead of night, are one of the most powerful and heartbreaking records of the massacre. They are a chronicle of the daily hell. "There probably is no crime that has not been committed in this city today," she wrote on one night. On another, after a particularly brutal day of fending off soldiers, she wrote, "O God, control the cruel beast in men." Her diary is not just a record of atrocities. It is a testament to the immense psychological burden she carried. She was responsible for 10,000 lives. Every woman who was dragged away was a personal failure. Every cry for help she couldn't answer a wound to her own soul. Minnie Vautrin's stand at Ginling College was an act of almost superhuman endurance and empathy. She was a beacon of light in the absolute darkness, a symbol of defiant compassion. She saved thousands of lives through her sheer refusal to give in to fear or despair. But the cost of this courage was immense. The things she saw, the things she heard, the things she was powerless to prevent, would eventually break her spirit. She would leave China a hero, but also a deeply wounded soul, a final, tragic casualty of the horrors she had fought so bravely to prevent. History is rarely simple. It is often a tapestry of contradictions, a place where heroes can be found in the most unlikely of uniforms. In the hell that was Nanking in the winter of 1937, the greatest protector of Chinese civilians, the man who would be hailed as a living Buddha and a god of mercy, was a loyal German businessman and a proud, card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. His name was John Rabe, and his story is one of the most profound and unsettling paradoxes of the 20th century. He was a man who served a regime of monstrous evil, yet in Nanking, he became the face of humanitarian goodness, using the very symbol of his party's ideology as a shield to save innocent lives. John Rabe was not a dissident or a rebel. He was a patriot, a man who believed in the resurgence of his German fatherland under Adolf Hitler. As the head of the Siemens Company in Nanking, he was a respected figure in the city's business community, a man known for his efficiency, his integrity, and his genuine affection for the Chinese people he had lived among for 3 decades. When the crisis loomed, he could have easily evacuated. He had his orders and his ticket home, but he chose to stay, compelled by a sense of duty that transcended national allegiance. As the elected chairman of the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, he became the reluctant leader of the city's last hope. NHI's home, a modest property in the heart of the safety zone, became a refugee camp in itself. He opened his doors, and soon his garden, his garage, and every room in his house were filled with over 600 terrified Chinese civilians who looked to him for protection. But his greatest weapon was not his home, it was his flag. On a tall pole in his garden, he flew a massive Nazi flag, its stark swastika, a bizarre and potent symbol in this Chinese city. To the Japanese soldiers, who knew Germany to be their nation's powerful new ally in the anti-Comintern Pact, the swastika was a sign to be respected. It was an emblem of friendly power, and Rabe wielded it with extraordinary skill. NHE turned his identity as a Nazi into a shield. When Japanese soldiers attempted to break into his property, he would stride out to confront them, his Nazi Party armband prominently displayed. He would berate them in a mixture of German and Chinese, invoking the name of his Führer and the alliance between their nations. The effect was often astonishing. The soldiers, who feared no Chinese authority, were frequently cowed by this furious, authoritative German. They would bow, apologize, and retreat, leaving the refugees in his garden untouched. He used the symbol of fascism to fight the horrors of fascism, a paradox he seemed to be either unaware of or untroubled by in the heat of the moment. Rabe's work extended far beyond his own garden. He became the chief administrator and roving defender of the entire safety zone. He spent his days in a frantic race against time, driving his car from one crisis to the next. He would arrive at a refugee camp to find soldiers attempting to carry off women, and he would charge into the fray, his presence and his armband often enough to stop the assault. He meticulously documented the atrocities he witnessed, writing detailed reports and letters of protest to the Japanese embassy and to his own government in Germany, believing that if his Führer, Adolf Hitler, knew of the horrors being committed by Germany's ally, he would surely intervene. It was a naive and tragically misplaced faith. His reports would be received in Berlin and quietly buried, ignored by a regime that had no interest in letting humanitarian concerns derail its strategic alliances. Like Minnie Vautrin, John Rabe kept a diary. It is a document of raw, unfiltered horror, a day-by-day accounting of the collapse of a city and the descent of an army into barbarism. He recorded the killings, the rapes, the looting, his pages filled with a growing sense of outrage and despair. "I have seen more dead, and mostly executed, people in the last few days than I have seen in my 50 years of life," he wrote. He described pulling a Japanese soldier off a young girl, and his frustration at his own powerlessness. "One wants to cry out in this misery, but my throat is hoarse from all the shouting and yelling." John Rabe was the "good Nazi of Nanking," a title that captures the profound moral complexity of his story. He was a flawed man in service to a monstrous ideology, yet his actions in Nanking were nothing short of heroic. He is credited with personally saving thousands of lives and with being the central pillar that held the entire safety zone project together. He stood in the breach when all other authority had fled, using the tools at his disposal, his courage, his status, and the very flag of his party, to defend the defenseless. His story is a powerful and disturbing reminder that the lines between good and evil are not always clear, and that even in the darkest of times, compassion can bloom in the most poisoned soil. As the days bled into weeks, the city of Nanking ceased to be a living place. It became a necropolis, a vast, silent tomb, haunted by the ghosts of what it once was, and the specter of what it had become. The initial, frenzied waves of mass killing and rape had subsided, not out of any return to morality, but out of a grim exhaustion. What remained was a city hollowed out, its spirit eviscerated, its every function of civilized life utterly shattered. The reign of terror now settled into a kind of dreary, perpetual nightmare, a state of suspended animation where the only laws were fear and the whim of the conqueror. The physical landscape of the city was one of utter devastation. Whole districts had been consumed by fires, some set during the siege, others lit deliberately by soldiers for sport or to cover up their crimes. The charred, skeletal remains of homes and shops stood like blackened teeth against the gray winter sky. The streets, once bustling with the vibrant energy of a capital, were now empty and silent, save for the rumble of a passing Japanese military truck or the solitary figure of a survivor scurrying for cover. But the most defining feature of this new landscape was the dead. The bodies were everywhere. They lay in the streets where they had been shot, in the alleyways where they had been bayoneted, in the canals where they had been dumped. They lay in tangled piles, frozen solid by the bitter cold, their limbs contorted in the final agony of their death. Living were forbidden from burying them. This edict from the Japanese command was a masterstroke of psychological cruelty. It forced the survivors to live amongst their dead, to navigate a city that had become a vast open grave. The presence of the corpses was a constant, inescapable reminder of the massacre, a tool to terrorize the living into absolute submission. The stench of decomposition, masked for a time by the cold, began to rise as the weeks wore on, a sweet, sickly smell that permeated everything. Packs of stray dogs, their owners gone, now roamed the city, feasting on the dead in a final, gruesome desecration. All civil order had vanished. There was no government, no police, no fire department. The only authority was the Japanese soldier, and his authority was absolute and arbitrary. Looting was rampant and systematic. Soldiers, and later Japanese civilians who followed in the army's wake, stripped the city of its remaining wealth. They broke into every home, every shop, every warehouse that had not already been burned. They took everything of value: furniture, art, family heirlooms, even doorknobs and wiring. What they could not carry, they often smashed. An act of pure, nihilistic vandalism. The city was being picked clean, its material culture erased along with its people, the survivors. Life was reduced to its most primitive elements. The primary struggle was for food. The city's supplies had been exhausted or looted. Starvation became a real and imminent threat. People risked their lives venturing out of the safety zone to forage in their abandoned homes, hoping to find a forgotten bag of rice or some withered vegetables. These foraging expeditions were fraught with peril. An encounter with a Japanese patrol could mean robbery, assault, or death. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. The survivors lived in a state of constant, gnawing fear. The sound of boots on the pavement, the sight of a uniform, the shout of a soldier, any of these could trigger a fresh wave of terror. They had witnessed the unimaginable. They had seen their family members killed, their neighbors dragged away, their homes destroyed. They were living in a world where all the rules of human decency had been suspended. Hope was a dangerous luxury. The future had been reduced to a single, desperate goal: to survive until the next sunrise. Nanking was no longer the jewel of the Yangtze. It was a city of ghosts, a cold, silent, and broken place, inhabited by the traumatized living and the unburied dead, a chilling monument to the complete and utter breakdown of humanity. Amidst the vast, anonymous slaughter of the Nanking Massacre, where tens of thousands were killed in nameless, faceless groups, one story emerged that would encapsulate the unique and depraved spirit of the atrocities. It was not a story of military necessity or of discipline breaking down under the stress of combat. It was a story of sport. It was the tale of two Japanese officers who, in the midst of the carnage, engaged in a personal competition to see who could be the first to kill 100 people using only a sword. This contest, far from being a hidden shame, was reported with celebratory glee in the Japanese press, a chilling window into a martial culture that had become pathologically twisted, glorifying mass murder as a feat of personal prowess. Two men were Second Lieutenants Toshiaki Mukai and Tsuyoshi Noda, both stationed with the 16th Division of the Imperial Japanese Army as it advanced on Nanking. They were young, ambitious officers, products of a military system that indoctrinated its men with the ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, and a fanatical devotion to the emperor. But this was a corrupted form of Bushido, one that had replaced honor and restraint with a bloodthirsty chauvinism and a profound contempt for the lives of non-Japanese. As their unit cut its bloody swath through the countryside towards the capital, the two lieutenants made a friendly wager. NTHE's story was picked up by the Tokyo Nichi Shimbun and the English-language Japan Advertiser, two of Japan's most prominent newspapers at the time. The articles were written in the breathless, enthusiastic tone of a sports report. They featured photographs of the two smiling officers, their swords held proudly. The headlines were bold and celebratory. Incredible record in the contest to cut down 100 people. Mukai 106, Noda 105. The articles described the competition in lurid detail, treating the act of slicing through human beings as if it were a fencing match or a baseball game. According to the reports, the contest began as their unit stormed the city of Wuxi. The rules were simple. The first to reach 100 kills with his katana would be the winner. The reporters chronicled their progress. By the time they reached the outskirts of Nanking, the score was neck and neck. One article described how Noda had killed 56 men, while Mukai had dispatched 78. The contest was so fierce, the report noted with admiration, that both of their blades had been slightly damaged. Noda was quoted as saying that hacking through a man in a single stroke was more difficult than he had imagined. And as the Japanese army breached the walls of Nanking, the contest reached its climax. The chaos and the abundance of helpless victims provided the perfect environment for the two officers to complete their grim tally. The final reports, published after the city's fall, declared that both men had surpassed their goal. Mukai had killed 106, while Noda had killed 105. The reporter described them laughing together, unable to determine who had reached the 100-kill mark first. And so, in a final, grotesque twist, they decided to raise the stakes and begin a new contest with a goal of 150 kills. This story, more than any other single incident, captured the moral abyss into which the Japanese army had fallen. It revealed that the killings were not just a matter of policy or uncontrolled rage, but had become a source of entertainment, a matter of personal and public pride. The sword, the soul of the samurai, had been transformed from a weapon of honor into a butcher's tool, its wielder's skill measured not in swordsmanship, but in the sheer volume of human lives extinguished. The fact that this was celebrated on the front pages of mainstream newspapers showed how deeply the poison had seeped into the nation's consciousness. The contest to kill 100 men was a microcosm of the entire massacre. It was organized, it was cruel, it was public, and it was driven by a profound and chilling belief that the lives of the victims had absolutely no value. It was murder as a spectator sport, and its memory would become an enduring symbol of the depravity that consumed Nanking. At the heart of the Nanking safety zone stood the University Hospital, a modern, well-equipped facility that had been a beacon of medical progress. During the massacre, it became the epicenter of the city's suffering, a house of horrors and miracles presided over by one lone, heroic, and increasingly desperate surgeon. His name was Dr. Robert O. Wilson, a tall, bespectacled American in his early 30s. When every other foreign doctor had evacuated, Wilson chose to stay, a decision that would plunge him into a waking nightmare of ceaseless work, unimaginable trauma, and profound despair over the depths of human cruelty. Before the fall of the city, the hospital was a place of order and healing. After December 13th, it became a charnel house. The wounded began to arrive in a relentless, horrifying flood. They were the direct, physical evidence of the atrocities being committed just outside the hospital walls. They came on stretchers, on the backs of relatives, or they crawled to the entrance on their own, leaving trails of blood on the frozen ground. The hospital, designed to hold a few hundred patients, was soon overwhelmed with thousands. They filled every bed, every cot, and then every available inch of floor space in the corridors, their moans of pain creating a constant, terrible symphony of suffering. NDR. Wilson was the only qualified surgeon for a city of 1 million people. He was assisted by a small, heroic team of Chinese nurses and staff who worked alongside him, risking their own lives every day. But the burden of surgery fell on his shoulders alone. For weeks he worked almost without rest, fueled by black coffee, adrenaline, and a desperate sense of duty. His world shrank to the four walls of the operating theater, a room that was perpetually slick with blood. He moved from one patient to the next, a human machine fighting a tidal wave of carnage. NTHE injuries he treated were a catalog of human depravity. He stitched up horrific bayonet wounds, the clean, deep punctures designed to kill. He treated men, women, and children who had been shot at close range, their bodies shattered by the bullets. He tried to save women who had been sexually assaulted with such violence that their internal organs were ruptured. He operated on people whose faces had been slashed by swords, or whose limbs had been hacked off. He saw things that no human being should ever have to see, a relentless parade of human bodies that had been systematically broken, tortured, and defiled. NHI's letters and diary entries from this period are a testament to the immense psychological toll of his work. He wrote not with the detached, clinical tone of a surgeon, but with the raw, visceral horror of a man witnessing the end of the world. "The slaughter of civilians is appalling," he wrote to his family. "I could go on for pages telling of cases of rape and brutality almost beyond belief." He described the sheer exhaustion, the feeling of being steeped in blood and gore, and the overwhelming sense of futility. For every life he managed to save, he knew there were hundreds more dying in the streets, beyond his help. NTHE Hospital itself was not a sanctuary. Japanese soldiers would frequently storm the building, searching for Chinese soldiers or women to rape. They would stalk through the wards, their boots echoing in the corridors, terrifying the wounded patients. Dr. Wilson, armed only with his moral authority and his American passport, would have to confront them, ordering them to leave, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. He described the constant, gnawing anxiety, the feeling that at any moment the soldiers might turn on him and his staff, bringing the slaughter directly into his operating room, NDR. Robert Wilson's work at the University Hospital was an act of sustained, superhuman heroism. He was a healer forced to work in the midst of a plague of violence, a man of science confronted with the absolute irrationality of human evil. He saved countless lives, his skilled hands literally stitching a city's wounds, one patient at a time. But the experience would leave him permanently scarred. He had stared directly into the abyss, had spent weeks wading through the blood and misery of the massacre. His despair was not just for the city of Nanking, but for all of humanity, for its terrifying capacity for cruelty, a capacity he had been forced to witness in its most raw and undiluted form.